8. Cologne Cathedral Tank Skirmish. Prior to World War II, Cologne was Germany's fourth largest city with around 800,000 residents. It was a major transportation hub and became an important industrial center for manufacturing war supplies, making it an appealing target to the Allies. Throughout the conflict, the British Royal Air Force bombed Cologne in 262 different air raids that were launched as a response to the Germans bombing London. By March of 1945, the city was essentially reduced to rubble and only 20,000 residents remained. On the night of March 3rd, the Allies dropped anti-Nazi propaganda leaflets from airplanes, letting civilians know that they didn't have to fear the advancing troops and urging them not to evacuate. 2 days later, they launched a three-pronged invasion into Cologne and toward the city's center as part of Operation Lumberjack, a plan to capture key German cities along the western bank of the Rhine River. In a harrowing encounter that was captured on film, 2 advancing American Sherman tanks got stuck on a pile of rubble at Cologne Cathedral, one of the only buildings that was still standing, as a German Panther tank pelted the Shermans with 75mm shells. A nearby U.S. Pershing tank approached the scene. The German tank commander mistook it for one of his own and told the gunner to hold his fire, giving the Pershing the perfect opportunity to take out the Panther. Within 2 days, the Allies had captured all of Cologne west of the Rhine, and by mid-April, they seized control of the rest of the city. 7. A Truce in the Forest. Also known as the Ardennes Offensive, Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive campaign on the Western Front during World War II. It lasted from December 16, 1944 to January 28, 1945, and took place near a tiny hunting cabin near the German-Belgian border, where a young boy named Fritz Winken with his mother hometown of Aachen was partially destroyed in a bombing raid. Just 8 days into the battle on Christmas Eve, there was a knock on the Winken family's front door. Fritz's mother answered the door to find 2 American soldiers standing there, along with a third injured soldier who was sitting on the ground. The trio had gotten separated from their battalion in the freezing cold, and the man on the ground had a life-threatening bullet wound to his leg. To the youngster's surprise, his mother invited the enemy troops inside and prepared a holiday meal for them. The men introduced themselves as Jim, Robin, and Harry. Everyone was about to sit down to eat when there was another knock at the door. Thinking it would be more Americans, Winken opened the door without hesitation, only to be greeted by 4 Wehrmacht soldiers. It was considered high treason to shelter enemy soldiers, and the little boy and his mother were frozen with fear about the consequence they might suffer for having Americans inside their cabin. To their surprise, the Germans politely explained that they had gotten separated from their regiment and asked for permission to spend the night. Before letting them in, Fritz's mother told them about the guests inside and warned them that she would have no gunfire in her house. At first, the Germans seemed taken aback and perhaps a little unhappy about what they were hearing. But Mrs. Winken implored them to forget about killing for one night and ordered them to put their weapons down. They complied, and when the Americans saw them doing it, they also handed their guns over to Fritz's mother. And in that tiny cabin, where there was scarcely enough seating for everyone, the enemy soldiers peacefully shared a meal. As the night wore on, their initial suspicions wore off. They got along like old friends. The next morning, they parted ways and went back to being on opposite sides of the battlefield. 6. The Strike on Taranto. On the night of November 11, 1940, roughly 5 months after Italy entered World War II, 21 British swordfish biplanes bombed the Italian naval fleet at Taranto Harbor. By then, the aircraft was obsolete, yet Taranto was powerful. But regaining control of the Mediterranean from the Axis powers after Italy's entry into the conflict was crucial to the Allied war effort, and the operation proceeded despite the RAF's outdated air power. The raid, also known as Operation Judgment, was carried out in 2 waves, with 12 of the aircraft making the initial attack and the rest of the swordfish striking 90 minutes later, pelted the Italian ships with torpedoes, flares, and bombs, catching the enemy completely off guard. Within the first few minutes of the raid, 3 major Italian battleships were taken out of action. 4 others were damaged. The Italians fought back against the British with heavy anti-aircraft fire, but they failed to gain the upper hand in the skirmish. In one fell swoop, the British wiped out half of Italy's battle fleet. delivering a blow that the country's navy, or its military in general, never fully recovered from throughout the rest of the war. On several occasions over the next 3 years, the Italian fleet chose not to fight against the now superior British Royal Navy. 5. The Anzio Landings. In January 1944, about 6 months into the Italian campaign, Allied forces had gotten bogged down at a series of Axis fortifications across central Italy. Fortifications known as the Gustav Line prevented them from reaching Rome like they had planned. Troops were exhausted from the amount of fighting it took for them to get that far, and morale was low. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill came up with the idea of circumventing the German fortifications by launching an amphibious attack on the coastal town of Anzio along Italy's western shore. If the invasion required Axis forces to pull troops away from the Gustav Line to defend Rome, it would make it a lot easier for the Allies to breach the Gustav Line. And if the Axis failed to pull troops away from the Gustav Line to defend Rome, the city would be vulnerable to capture, which would isolate Axis troops at the Gustav Line and essentially leave them at the mercy of the Allies. As long as the Axis forces didn't have enough manpower to defend both Rome and the Gustav Line, the Allies had a good chance of obtaining their objective. U.S. Army Major General John Lucas thought the plan would fail, that the Allies had far too little manpower, but he was ordered to proceed. And on January 22, 1944, 36,000 soldiers and 3,200 vehicles arrived on the shore of Anzio. Their arrival went practically unopposed by the enemy at first, giving Lucas a chance to make advantageous moves. But his lack of confidence in the operation made him reluctant to act, giving the Axis forces an opportunity to launch a more powerful defense than the Allies had prepared for. For more than 3 months, the adversaries engaged in a war of attrition. In other words, both sides were trying to wear the enemy down to the point where they were too weak to fight. The Allies finally launched a major offensive on the Gustav Line in late May. At the same time, Polish soldiers captured nearby Monte Cassino. This final exasperated push forced German troops to retreat north of Rome. While the Allies technically won the painstaking face-off, it wasn't exactly a victory to brag about. But they had seized Rome and could proceed with the next chapter of the Italian campaign, which was now undeniably tipping in their favor. How do you think this would have played out if General John Lucas had more faith in the plan? Tell us in the comments below, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. The Allied invasion of Sicily. Before dawn on July 10, 1943. About a year before the D-Day landings at Normandy, Allied forces invaded German-occupied Sicily in what was, at that point, the largest amphibious operation in history. About 478,000 British and American troops stormed the island, where they expected to encounter 300,000 enemy soldiers. Also known as Operation Husky, it was the Allies' first step back into Axis-occupied Europe and marked the beginning of the Italian campaign. The Germans fought back fiercely as Allied troops arrived by air and sea on different parts of the island. To distract the Nazis away from meaningful combat, the Allies staged several false operations, which proved key to weakening their opponent. By late July, the Allies began capturing key territories, squeezing the Germans into increasingly small pockets of the island. At the same time, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was overthrown, leaving Hitler feeling unusually defeated. In a rare instance of the Nazi tyrant backing down to the enemy, he gave his military leaders permission to leave Sicily. On the night of August 11th, around 100,000 Axis troops were evacuated to mainland Italy overnight. Just days later, the Allies officially declared victory, marking a critical step in retaking Axis-occupied territory. 3. Operation Bagration. On the night of June 21, 1944, the Soviet Red Army launched the first attacks of World War II's largest Allied offensive, codenamed Operation Bagration, in German-occupied Byelorussia, known today as Belarus. By then, the Russians had deceived the Germans into thinking their summer offensive would be focused in Ukraine, and the Nazis had diverted some of their manpower away from the actual planned attack location. The campaign was carried out in 3 phases over a roughly 2-month period, with a 2.3 million strong force that was armed to the hilt with artillery, tanks, explosives, and guns. The Soviets squashed the German resistance, destroying 3 Axis armies and ripping the Eastern Front wide open as they plowed their way through Byelorussia. In what's been described as a series of brilliant but brutal assaults, the Red Army struck when and where the Nazis least expected it. They advanced hundreds of miles in a remarkably short period, pushing their way into Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe, and the Baltic region. The Russians also attacked Axis forces in Romania and crippled Bulgaria's troops, ending the country's involvement in the war. When Operation Bagration ended on August 19th, the Red Army had completely retaken Byelorussia and were gaining ground in eastern Poland. Germany suffered an estimated 450,000 casualties, and another 300,000 soldiers spent nearly a year surrounded by the Soviet military and helplessly separated from other Nazi forces. The Russians also suffered heavy casualties, including 180,000 killed or missing. But they accomplished their biggest defeat in German military history and gained access to territories that put them within striking distance of Berlin, marking a major turning point in favor of the Allies. 2. Warsaw Uprising. In July 1944, the Soviet Red Army advanced through German-occupied Belarus and toward Poland, covering as much as 25 miles per day. By the end of the month, they had nearly reached Warsaw's outskirts, and the Germans had evacuated the city. Hitler ordered his retreating troops to return to Warsaw, where they told the Poles to prepare for battle against the Red Army. But the Polish underground resistance, known as the Polish Home Army, had other ideas. The clandestine movement was formed in 1939 after the city fell to the Nazis and grew to include 38,000 members in Warsaw alone. But these resistance fighters lacked the vehicles, guns, and ammunition to realistically win a fight against the Nazis. Encouraged by the Red Army's impending arrival, General Tadeusz Komorowski ordered the ragtag force to attack the returning Nazis on August 1st. The Germans were taken by surprise, and the Poles managed to capture several neighborhoods while heavy fighting continued elsewhere throughout Warsaw. Within days, the already under-equipped Poles began to run low on ammunition, but they could hear the Red Army fighting with the Germans just a few miles away. So they held out, confident that the Russians would arrive soon. But it didn't happen. According to Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, his troops were exhausted and needed to rest and resupply. He refused to allow American or British aircraft to land on what was now considered Soviet soil, leaving the Polish Home Army on its own against the Germans. Hitler ordered his troops to exterminate all of the resistance fighters and destroy Warsaw, and he sent reinforcements in for backup. The Red Army was just 10 miles away, 16 kilometers the entire time. But Stalin didn't think the Poles deserved any help. Meanwhile, the Nazis laid siege to Warsaw and the people in it, killing an estimated 150,000 Poles and leaving the city in shambles. The survivors were marched out of Warsaw and into the gas chambers, where they were executed. 1. The Ardennes Offensive. By late 1944, it was clear that the Allies were winning the war. It started to feel like it would be all over soon. But Hitler wasn't ready to give up his quest for world dominance, launched a surprise attack on the Allies in hopes of turning the war back in his favor. In what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans cut through the densely forested Ardennes region between Belgium and Luxembourg to reach a vast stretch of front where tens of thousands of US troops were spread out. The Americans were caught completely off guard when they awoke to Nazi tanks barreling straight at them in what would be the heaviest artillery bombardment that many, if not most of them, had ever experienced. But they fought back fiercely against the Germans and quick to block roads that were critical to achieving a Nazi victory. An estimated 450,000 Germans participated in the Ardennes offensive, but they represented the absolute last of the country's able-bodied fighters. Battle lasted for around 6 weeks, and somewhere between 63,000 and 98,000 German troops were killed. Hitler's depleted armored forces and Luftwaffe personnel were never replaced. While the Allies ultimately won the battle, their victory came at a high cost. Of the 610,000 American troops that fought, around 89,000 died. making the Bulge the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the US during the war, and the third deadliest campaign in the country's history. Thanks for watching. Which one of these crazy confrontations shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.